Let me start with something that lives in the space between knowing and not knowing. Some people grow up waiting for answers that never arrive, not just once, not just in one relationship or one situation, but repeatedly. Answers about why someone left, why something ended, what they did wrong, whether they mattered at all. Answers about why their parent went silent, why their friend disappeared without explanation, why their partner ghosted, why the apology never came, why the conversation never finished, why the conflict was never resolved. And the strange part is not just that the answers never arrived, it is that they kept waiting anyway. They kept checking, they kept hoping, they kept replaying events in their minds, looking for clues they might have missed. They kept the door open, mentally, emotionally, sometimes literally, in case the person who left might return with the explanation that would finally make everything make sense. Many of these people do not realize how deep this pattern runs until they are adults. They look back and notice that they have spent years waiting for their father to explain why he became distant, waiting for their mother to acknowledge the harm that was done, waiting for the friend who ghosted to say what went wrong, waiting for the partner who ended things abruptly to give a reason, waiting for the boss who fired them to justify the decision, waiting for anyone, everyone to finish the sentences they started, to close the loops they opened, to provide the clarity that would allow confusion to finally rest. But the answers did not come, and still they waited. Not because they believed waiting would work, but because moving forward without understanding felt impossible. This creates a specific psychological imprint that most people never put into words. It is not anxiety in the traditional sense, though anxiety is often present. It is not depression, though the weight of unanswered questions can feel crushing. It is something more specific. It is intolerance for ambiguity, the inability to rest in not knowing, the compulsion to understand why things happened the way they did, the belief, held so deeply it feels like truth, that without answers healing is impossible, that without closure moving forward is irresponsible, that without understanding they are doomed to repeat whatever mistake caused the ending in the first place. And so they wait. They wait for the text that explains, for the email that apologizes, for the conversation that brings clarity, for the moment when everything will suddenly make sense. But the moment does not come, and the waiting becomes not just an action but an identity. They become people who live in limbo, one foot in the past waiting for it to resolve, one foot in the present unable to fully engage because the past is still open, still active, still unfinished. What makes this particularly painful is that the waiting is not passive, it is not peaceful, it is active, consuming, exhausting. Their minds loop endlessly through the same events, the same conversations, the same moments, looking for the answer that will unlock the confusion. They replay what was said and what was not said. They analyze tone, timing, body language. They construct timelines. They test theories. They create narratives to fill the void where explanation should be. And sometimes these narratives feel true. They feel like understanding. They feel like the answer. But they are not. They are stories the mind creates to survive the absence of truth. And no matter how convincing the story, it never brings the relief that an actual answer would bring. Because the mind knows the difference between a constructed narrative and a real explanation, between closure you give yourself and closure you receive, and it resists settling for the former when it believes it deserves the latter. The paradox lives in the body as much as the mind. There is a physical discomfort in unanswered questions, a tension that does not release, a restlessness that cannot settle. The nervous system remains activated, waiting for resolution that will signal safety, waiting for the moment it can file the experience away as complete. But that moment never comes, and so the activation continues. The body stays alert, the mind stays engaged, and the person stays stuck. Not because they want to be, but because the human brain is designed to seek completion, to close loops, to finish stories. And when stories remain open, when questions remain unanswered, the brain keeps them active, keeps returning to them, keeps trying to solve them, not out of stubbornness, but out of design. This is how the mind works, and when the world refuses to provide the information the mind needs to complete its processing, the mind does not simply give up. It keeps trying, endlessly, exhaustingly, hopelessly. And here is what most people do not understand. The person waiting for answers is not being difficult. They are not choosing to dwell. They are not refusing to move on out of spite or weakness. They are genuinely unable to close the chapter because the chapter is not finished. The story does not have an ending. The question does not have an answer. And their brain, their nervous system, their entire psychological structure is screaming at them that something is incomplete, that they cannot move forward until this is resolved, that trying to let go without understanding is not healing, it is avoidance, it is pretending, it is leaving a wound open and calling it healed. So they do not let go, they cannot let go, they wait, and they wait, and they wait. Not because waiting brings them peace, but because not waiting feels like abandoning themselves, like giving up on the truth they deserve, like accepting that their confusion, their pain, their need for understanding simply does not matter enough for anyone to address. This is the psychology of the person who waits for answers that never arrive. It is not a story of patience. It is a story of limbo, of a mind that learned early that the world does not always provide clarity, that people leave without explanation, that harm is done without acknowledgement, that endings arrive without reasons. And yet the mind also learned that understanding is essential, that without knowing why, you cannot prevent future pain, that without answers, you cannot learn, cannot grow, cannot protect yourself from repetition. So the mind becomes trapped between two truths. The truth that answers may never come, and the truth that moving forward without them feels dangerous. And in that trap, the person waits, not happily, not peacefully, but persistently, because waiting is all they know how to do, and the alternative, accepting permanent uncertainty, feels unbearable. As a child, receiving answers is supposed to feel automatic, not earned, not begged for, not endlessly pursued, just given. When you ask why, someone explains. When something ends, you are told the reason. When you're confused, clarification arrives. When you make a mistake, someone helps you understand what went wrong so you can do better next time. When relationships change, the change is explained. When rules shift, the shift is made clear. This is how children learn to navigate the world, through feedback, through explanation, through the steady provision of information that helps them make sense of their experiences. And when this happens consistently, the child internalizes a foundational belief. The world makes sense. People are understandable, confusion is temporary, questions get answered, and life, while sometimes difficult, is ultimately knowable. When answers arrive naturally, the child learns that uncertainty is not threatening. It is simply a state that precedes understanding. They learn to tolerate the brief discomfort of not knowing because they trust that knowing will come. They learn that endings, while sad, are clear, that when something shifts, someone will explain why, that they are not expected to navigate confusion alone, that the adults around them, the world around them, will provide the information necessary to make sense of their experience. This creates a baseline of security, not just emotional security, but cognitive security. The sense that the world is coherent, that cause and effect are linked, that actions have explanations, that people do things for reasons, and those reasons can be known. This security allows the child to focus on other things, on learning, on growing, on exploring, because they are not using all their mental energy trying to decode mysteries, trying to fill gaps, trying to survive without the information they need. But when a child's questions go unanswered, when endings arrive without explanation, they notice everything. They notice the silence where words should be. They notice adults who respond to quote 0 with quote 1 instead of actual reasons. They notice relationships that end without discussion. They notice conflicts that never resolve, just fade into uncomfortable quiet. They notice punishments without explanations. They notice distance without cause. They notice that sometimes people just stop talking, stop showing up, stop caring, and no one explains why. The child asks, the child waits, the child hopes, but the answers do not come, and so the child learns something different, something darker. They learn that the world is not always coherent, that people are not always understandable, that confusion is not always temporary, that questions do not always get answered, and that sometimes you're expected to just accept this, to move on without understanding, to live with the gaps. This learning shapes everything that follows, because the child does not just accept that answers are sometimes withheld. The child internalizes that the withholding means something. It means they do not deserve explanation. It means their confusion does not matter. It means their need to understand is not important enough to address. It means they are not worth the effort it would take to provide clarity. And so the unanswered questions become about more than just not knowing. They become about worth, about value, about whether the child matters enough to be given the basic respect of explanation. And when the answer to that question, implied by the silence, is no, the child carries that answer into everything else, into every future relationship, into every future confusion, into every future ending. The belief that they do not matter enough to be given answers becomes the lens through which all future unanswered questions are interpreted, and so the child adapts. But the adaptation does not look like acceptance, it looks like waiting. Waiting becomes the strategy, the coping mechanism, the way of managing the unbearable discomfort of not knowing. The child waits for their parent to come back and explain why they left, waits for their friend to return and say why they stopped talking, waits for the teacher to clarify why they were punished, waits for anyone to finally provide the information that will make the confusion stop, and sometimes, rarely, the answer comes. And in those moments, the relief is profound, the question is answered, the loop is closed, the story is complete, and the mind can finally rest. This relief teaches the child something. It teaches them that waiting can work, that patience can be rewarded, that if you hold on long enough, eventually clarity arrives, and so waiting becomes reinforced. Not as a passive state, but as an active strategy, a way of maintaining hope, a way of refusing to give up on the possibility that understanding is coming, just not yet. But more often, the answer does not come. More often, the child waits and waits and nothing happens. The parent never explains, the friend never returns, the teacher never clarifies, the confusion remains, and the child is left with nothing but their own theories, their own narratives, their own attempts to make sense of what happened. They start to fill the gaps themselves. They decide the parent left because they were too difficult, the friend stopped talking because they were annoying, the teacher punished them because they were bad. These narratives are painful, but they are better than nothing, better than the complete absence of explanation, because at least a painful story is a story. At least it provides some framework, some sense of cause and effect. Even if the effect is that the child is at fault, at least it is an answer. At least it stops the endless wondering. The child without answers learns one powerful lesson early. If I do not understand why, I cannot prevent it from happening again. So I must wait until understanding comes. And that belief shapes everything that follows. It shapes how they approach relationships, how they handle conflict, how they respond to endings, how they navigate uncertainty. Every situation that lacks clarity triggers the old pattern, the compulsion to wait, to seek, to demand, to not let go until understanding arrives. Because letting go without understanding feels like abandoning the only protection they have, the protection that comes from knowing, from learning, from understanding what went wrong so it can be avoided in the future. And without that protection, the world feels chaotic, unpredictable, dangerous. So they do not let go. They hold on. They wait. Even when waiting brings no peace. Even when waiting becomes its own form of suffering. Because the suffering of waiting still feels safer than the terror of not knowing. There is a specific type of psychology that develops when answers are consistently withheld. It is not anxiety in the traditional sense. It is intolerance for ambiguity, an almost physical inability to rest in uncertainty. Where most people can tolerate not knowing, can shrug and move forward, can accept that some questions will never be answered, the person who waited for answers as a child cannot. Not knowing feels dangerous. It feels destabilizing. It feels like standing on ground that could collapse at any moment because you do not know what is underneath. And so they seek, they ask, they press, they analyze, they demand clarity in situations where clarity may not be possible. They need to understand why their partner seems distant, why their friend did not respond to a text, why their coworker acted cold, why their boss gave them that look. Every ambiguity becomes a threat. Every uncertainty becomes something that must be resolved immediately. Not because they are controlling, not because they are anxious in a generalized sense, but because ambiguity to them is not neutral. It is dangerous. It is the feeling they had as a child when no one would explain what was happening, when confusion was left to fester, when uncertainty meant something bad was coming but they did not know what or when or why. This intolerance creates a specific pattern in relationships. They need to know where they stand. They need to understand how the other person feels. They need clarity about intentions, expectations, the future. And they need this clarity not eventually, not when it arises naturally, but now, immediately, because waiting feels unbearable, because the space between question and answer is where their childhood pain lives, where they were left alone with confusion that never resolved. And so they push, they ask repeatedly, they seek reassurance, they demand definitions. Quotey becomes an urgent question, not a casual one. Quote 3 becomes something they ask after every slight shift in energy. They monitor, they scan, they check. They need constant confirmation that everything is clear, that nothing is ambiguous, that there are no unanswered questions lurking in the space between them. From the outside, this can look like anxiety, like insecurity, like neediness, and in some ways, it is all of those things. But underneath, it is something more specific. It is a nervous system that learned early that ambiguity precedes abandonment, that confusion precedes loss, that when things are unclear, bad things are coming, and so clarity becomes survival, understanding becomes safety, and the person will do almost anything to obtain it, even if that means pushing people away through the very act of seeking closeness, even if it means creating the distance they fear through their inability to tolerate uncertainty. Because the need to know feels more urgent than the risk of pushing. The fear of ambiguity feels more threatening than the fear of rejection. And so they choose. They choose pressing over waiting. They choose demanding over trusting. They choose the relief of clarity, even if the clarity is painful, over the torment of not knowing. The belief that drives this pattern is simple but powerful. If I do not know why, I cannot be safe. Understanding becomes equated with control, with protection, with the ability to prevent future harm. Because if you understand why something happened, you can learn from it, you can adjust, you can make sure it does not happen again. But if you do not understand, you are helpless, vulnerable, at risk of repeating whatever mistake you made without even knowing you made it. And so not knowing becomes intolerable, not just uncomfortable, not just frustrating, but genuinely threatening. The mind interprets lack of clarity as lack of safety. And safety is not optional, it is fundamental. So the mind will not rest until clarity is achieved, until the question is answered, until the confusion is resolved. And if resolution never comes, the mind never rests. It just keeps working, keeps trying, keeps seeking, exhaustingly, endlessly, desperately. This is why many people who wait for answers become adults who cannot let things go, not because they are stubborn, not because they enjoy dwelling, but because letting go without understanding feels like accepting chaos, like admitting that the world is fundamentally unknowable, that people are fundamentally unpredictable, that harm can arrive without reason and disappear without explanation. And accepting this feels unbearable. It feels like giving up on the basic coherence of existence. So they do not accept it. They do not let go. They hold on. They wait. They analyze. They theorize. They demand. They push. Not because they think it will work, but because the alternative, accepting that they will never know, feels worse than any amount of waiting. Another deep imprint of unanswered questions is how these individuals learn to create narratives. When answers do not come from outside, they must come from inside. And so the mind becomes exceptionally skilled at constructing explanations, at filling gaps, at building stories that make sense of senselessness. They take the few facts they have and extrapolate entire narratives. They interpret silence. They read into absence. They find meaning in details others would overlook. And these narratives can be elaborate, sophisticated, convincing. They can feel true. They can feel like insight, like understanding, like they have finally figured it out, finally pieced together what happened and why. But the truth is, these narratives are constructions, guesses dressed up as certainty, theories presented as facts, the mind's attempt to provide what the world refused to give. This looks from the outside like overthinking, like obsession, like an inability to move on. But from the inside, it feels like survival, like the only way to make sense of pain that was never explained. The person analyzes every detail of the ending, every word that was said, every text that was sent, every shift in energy. They replay conversations looking for the moment things changed. They search for clues they might have missed. They construct timelines. They notice patterns. They build theories. This person ended things because of what I said 3 weeks ago. That person left because they were scared of intimacy. This situation fell apart because of timing. That conflict happened because of miscommunication. And sometimes these theories are correct. Sometimes the narrative they construct is close to truth. But more often, the narrative is simply the story that feels most bearable, the explanation that allows them to make sense of chaos, even if it is not actually what happened. The narratives they create often center on their own fault, not because they are masochistic, but because blaming themselves provides a sense of control. If it was something I did, then I can fix it. If it was something about me, then I can change it. If I caused this, then I can prevent it from happening again. But if it was random, if it was about them, if there was no reason at all, then I am helpless. And helplessness is more frightening than guilt. So they create narratives where they are the problem, where their behavior, their personality, their mistakes caused the ending. This is painful, but it is better than the alternative, better than accepting that sometimes things end for reasons that have nothing to do with you, that sometimes people leave without explanation because they do not care enough to provide one. That sometimes the silence is not a puzzle to be solved, but simply an absence of care. Accepting this would mean accepting powerlessness, and powerlessness feels unbearable, so they choose guilt instead. They choose narratives where they are at fault, because at least fault can be corrected, at least mistakes can be learned from, at least there is something they can do. But constructed narratives never satisfy the way real answers do. The mind knows the difference. It knows when it is working with facts and when it is working with speculation. And speculation, no matter how convincing, never brings the closure that truth brings. So the person remains unsettled. They have their theory. They have their explanation. But it does not feel resolved. It feels provisional, temporary, like it could be wrong. And if it could be wrong, then they need to keep analyzing, keep searching, keep looking for the real answer, the true explanation, the one that will finally make everything click into place. And so the cycle continues. They create a narrative, they find it insufficient, they create another one, they test it against the facts, they revise it, they search for more information, they replay events, they analyze again, and the loop never closes, because the loop was never meant to be closed by them. It was meant to be closed by the person who left, by the person who went silent, by the person who owed them an explanation, but that person never provided it. And so the person is left trying to complete a circle with only half the information needed, and it cannot be done. But they try anyway, because trying feels better than accepting that completion is impossible. Psychologically, this is the mind trying to create certainty in uncertainty. If I can construct the answer, I can stop waiting for it. But constructed answers never satisfy the way real ones do. The mind knows when it is filling gaps with guesses, and guesses, no matter how sophisticated, never bring the peace that truth brings. So the constructed narrative provides temporary relief, a brief sense of understanding. But the relief does not last, because underneath the question remains unanswered. The loop remains open, and the mind knows it, and so it keeps returning, keeps analysing, keeps searching, not because the person enjoys this, but because the mind will not rest until the question is truly answered. And if the question will never be truly answered, the mind will never truly rest. It will just keep trying, keep working, keep hoping that maybe this time, with one more analysis, one more replay, one more theory, the answer will finally appear. Another trait often seen in people who wait for answers is their relationship with closure. For most people, closure is something desired but not required. They would like to understand why things ended. They would prefer to have clarity. But if clarity does not come, they can still move forward. They can accept that some things will remain mysteries, that some questions will never be answered, that some people will never explain themselves. And while this is disappointing, it is not devastating. They grieve what ended. They process the confusion, and eventually they move on. But for the person who waited for answers as a child, closure is not just desired, it is necessary. It feels like a prerequisite for moving forward, like something the beast be obtained before healing can begin. And without it, they remain stuck, frozen in the moment the thing ended, unable to grieve fully because grief requires accepting the ending. And accepting the ending requires understanding it, and understanding it requires answers they do not have. This creates a specific pattern. They seek closure from people who will never give it. They reach out to people who ghosted them, asking for explanation. They write letters to parents who will never respond. They send messages to exes demanding to know what went wrong. They reopen old wounds in the hope that this time, finally, the other person will provide the clarity they need. And sometimes, rarely, the other person responds. Sometimes they get the conversation they have been waiting for. And in those moments, the relief is profound, even if the answer is painful, even if the explanation confirms their worst fears. At least they have it. At least the loop is closed. At least they can finally grieve and move forward. But more often, the person does not respond, or they respond with something vague, something incomplete, something that creates more questions than it answers. And the person waiting for closure is left with even more confusion, even more unanswered questions, even more reasons to keep waiting. What they do not realize or cannot accept is that closure is not always something another person can give you. Sometimes closure is internal. Sometimes it is the decision to stop waiting, to accept that you will never understand, to grieve what ended even though you do not know why it ended. to move forward without the answers you deserve. This sounds simple, but for someone whose entire psychological framework is built on the belief that understanding is necessary for safety, this is almost impossible. It feels like giving up, like accepting defeat, like admitting that their confusion does not matter, that their need to understand is not important, that they are not worth the explanation they have been waiting for. And so, they resist. They keep seeking. They keep asking. They keep waiting. Because waiting, however painful, feels more dignified than accepting that the answers will never come, that the person who left will never explain, that the closure they need will never arrive from outside, that it must be created from within. And creating closure for yourself feels like settling, like making do, like giving yourself the scraps of understanding when you deserve the full meal. So they do not do it, they wait, and the waiting becomes its own form of suffering. The belief that drives this is clear. Without answers, healing is impossible. Without understanding why, I cannot move on. Without closure from the person who caused the pain, I cannot let go. This belief feels true. It feels logical. It feels like common sense. But it is also a trap, because it gives all the power to the other person. It makes your healing contingent on their willingness to provide explanation. It means you cannot move forward until they decide you deserve to. And if they never decide you deserve to, you remain stuck forever, waiting for permission to heal that will never be granted. And this is the cruelest part of the pattern. Not just that answers never arrive, but that waiting for answers prevents the healing that could happen without them. The person stays tethered to the past, unable to fully engage with the present, unable to build a future, because the past is still open, still active, still demanding resolution, and until it gets resolution, everything else must wait. This is not weakness. It is the logical conclusion of a mind that learned closure is external, that understanding must come from the person who caused confusion, that moving on requires permission from the person who left. When these beliefs are formed in childhood, they feel like truth, like the way the world works. And unlearning them requires more than just intellectual understanding. It requires something deeper. It requires the nervous system to accept what the mind resists. That some questions will never be answered. That some endings will never be explained. That some people will never give you what you deserve. And that healing must happen anyway, without their permission, without their explanation. Without the closure they refuse to provide. This acceptance is not easy. It is not quick. And for many people, it does not come until the pain of waiting finally exceeds the pain of letting go. There is also a specific relationship these individuals develop with silence. For most people, silence is neutral. Sometimes it means something. Sometimes it means nothing. Sometimes a text goes unanswered because the person is busy. Sometimes a conversation pauses because there is nothing more to say. Sometimes distance appears because life happens. But for the person who waited for answers as a child, silence is never neutral. Silence is threatening. Silence is punishment. Silence means something is wrong. Something has shifted. Something is ending, and they need to know what. They need to understand why. They need to fix it before it becomes permanent. And so, silence triggers immediate panic, immediate action, immediate attempts to fill the void with words, with questions, with contact. This shows up in small ways and large ways. A text that goes unanswered for a few hours creates anxiety. A friend who does not respond to a message immediately triggers worry. A partner who is quiet after a disagreement feels like abandonment. A co-worker who stops saying hello must mean something happened. Every gap in communication becomes a threat. Every pause becomes something that must be explained. Every moment of silence becomes evidence that something is wrong, and the person cannot rest until the silence is broken, until the gap is filled, until they know what the silence means, because silence to them is not just absence of words, it is absence of clarity, and absence of clarity is absence of safety. So they reach out, they check in, they ask if everything is okay, they demand to know what is wrong. They cannot tolerate the space, cannot sit with the uncertainty, cannot allow the silence to just be. The association is clear. Silence equals something is wrong. This association was learned early, learned through experiences where silence preceded loss, where gaps in communication became permanent, where people who went quiet never came back, where the absence of explanation meant the end of relationship. And so the nervous system learned to interpret silence as danger, to respond to quiet with alarm, to mobilize immediately when words stop coming. This is not irrational. This is adaptive. It is the nervous system trying to protect against future pain by catching problems early, by addressing silence before it becomes abandonment, by demanding clarity before confusion becomes permanent. The problem is not that the response is wrong. The problem is that the response is disproportionate. That not all silence means what childhood silence meant, that sometimes people are just busy, sometimes they need space, sometimes there is nothing wrong. But the nervous system does not differentiate. It responds to all silence as though it is the dangerous kind. And this creates problems. In relationships, this pattern shows up as clinginess, as neediness, as an inability to give space. The person texts constantly, calls frequently, needs regular reassurance, cannot tolerate gaps in communication, interprets brief periods of silence as evidence that something is wrong. And when their partner does not respond immediately, they panic. They send more messages. They call. They demand to know what is happening. They need confirmation that everything's okay, that the silence does not mean what they fear it means, that the person is not pulling away, not losing interest, not preparing to leave. And often, this behavior creates exactly what it is trying to prevent. The partner feels smothered, overwhelmed, pressured, and they pull away, not because anything was wrong initially, but because the constant demand for reassurance becomes exhausting, and so the silence that was nothing becomes something. The gap that meant nothing becomes meaningful, and the person's worst fear, that silence means ending, becomes self-fulfilling. Psychologically, this makes sense. If silence once meant disappearance, if gaps once became permanent, then every moment of quiet feels like the beginning of an ending. The body remembers what the mind wants to forget. It remembers the parent who went silent and never explained why. The friend who stopped responding and never came back. The relationship that ended without warning, without explanation, just sudden absence where presence used to be. And so the body does not take chances with silence. It responds immediately. It mobilizes. It demands answers before the silence has time to become permanent. This is not conscious. This is not chosen. This is automatic. The nervous system doing what it was trained to do, protecting against abandonment by refusing to tolerate ambiguity, by insisting on clarity, by filling gaps before they can become loss. But the cost is high. The cost is that the person can never rest in relationship, can never trust silence, can never allow space. Because space feels like the beginning of ending. An ending without explanation is the thing they fear most. Another area where the effects become visible is in how they process endings. For most people, endings are painful but finite. A relationship ends. There is sadness, there is grief, but eventually, the grief processes, the pain fades, the ending becomes part of the past, and life moves forward. But for the person who waits for answers, endings do not work this way. Endings without explanation do not feel like endings. They feel like pauses, like interruptions, like something that might still be resumed once clarity arrives. And so the relationship does not actually end. Not internally. It remains open. The person keeps the door unlocked, keeps checking to see if the other person will return, keeps hoping that one day the explanation will come, and with it, resolution, closure, the ability to finally let go. But that day does not come, and so the ending that should have been complete remains incomplete. The relationship that should have become past remains present, and the person lives in limbo, unable to fully move forward because the past has not been fully released. This shows up in specific behaviours. They keep the person's number saved. They check their social media regularly. They notice when the person is online. They track their activity. They note changes in their life. They watch from a distance, waiting for the moment when the person might reach out, might explain, might finally provide the answers they have been waiting for. And sometimes years pass, years of checking, years of waiting, years of hoping, and nothing happens. The person never reaches out, never explains, never acknowledges that they left without closure. And the person waiting is left with nothing but their own theories, their own narratives, their own attempts to make sense of an ending that was never explained. But the ending still does not feel complete, still does not feel past. Because how can something be past when you do not understand what happened? How can you close a chapter when the last pages are missing? How can you move forward when you are still waiting for resolution? The inability to accept endings without explanation creates a specific kind of stuck. Not the stuck of depression, where everything feels heavy and movement feels impossible, but the stuck of limbo, where you are neither in the relationship nor fully out of it, neither grieving actively nor moving forward, just waiting, existing in the space between what was and what could be, hoping that clarity will arrive and allow you to finally process the loss, but clarity does not arrive, and so the waiting continues, and the years pass, and the person remains tethered to something that ended long ago, but never quite became past. Because past requires completion, and completion requires understanding, and understanding requires answers, and answers never came. This is not denial, it is the natural response to incomplete information. The mind resists closing a chapter when the last pages are missing, so the story stays open. And the waiting continues, even when the waiting brings no peace, even when the waiting prevents new relationships, even when the waiting becomes its own form of suffering. Because closing the story without knowing how it ends feels wrong, feels premature, feels like giving up on the truth you deserve, and so you do not close it. You leave it open, you wait, and the waiting, over time, becomes less about hoping the person will return and more about refusing to accept that you will never understand, that the confusion will never resolve, that the question will never be answered. And refusing to accept this feels like the last bit of dignity you have, the last bit of control, the last way of saying that what happened mattered, that you deserved better than to be left in confusion. Even if no one else ever acknowledges this, you will acknowledge it by refusing to move on until the answers come, even if that means never moving on at all. Another deep imprint shows up in their relationship with apologies. For most people, apologies are nice when they come, but not necessary for healing. They can forgive without an apology. They can accept that the other person will never acknowledge the harm. And while this is disappointing, it does not prevent them from letting go. But for the person who waited for answers as a child, apologies are not nice. They are necessary. They are the proof that what happened was real, that the harm was real, that they were not imagining it, that they were not overreacting, that they deserved better. And without this proof, healing feels impossible. How can you forgive without acknowledgement? How can you let go without validation? How can you move forward when the person who hurt you never admitted they hurt you? This creates a specific pattern. They wait for apologies that never come. They wait for their parent to admit the damage they caused. They wait for their ex to acknowledge how they were treated. They wait for their friend to recognize the betrayal. They wait for anyone, everyone to simply say, "I was wrong. I hurt you. I am sorry." And in those rare moments when the apology comes, the relief is overwhelming, even if it comes years late, even if it comes after the damage is done. The apology validates their experience. It confirms that they were not crazy, that what they felt was real, that they deserved acknowledgement. And with that validation, healing can finally begin. But more often, the apology never comes, and they are left waiting for someone to care enough to admit fault, to recognize harm, to take responsibility. And the waiting over time becomes less about the apology itself and more about what the apology represents: proof that they mattered, proof that what happened to them was wrong, proof that they deserved better. The years spent waiting for an apology are years spent in a specific kind of pain, the pain of unacknowledged harm, the pain of being treated poorly and having the person who treated you poorly act as though nothing happened, the pain of watching the person who hurt you move on with their life while you remain stuck in the hurt they caused. And the worst part is that the person who hurt you often has no idea you are waiting. They have moved on, they have forgotten, or they never cared to begin with, and you are left holding pain that has nowhere to go. Pain that cannot be processed because it was never validated. Harm that cannot be healed because it was never acknowledged. And so you wait. You hope that one day they will realize what they did, that they will reach out, that they will say the words you need to hear, that they will finally give you the closure you deserve. But the fantasy is almost always just that, a fantasy. Because people who refuse to apologize rarely change their minds. People who hurt others without acknowledgement rarely develop the self-awareness or empathy required to recognize the harm they caused. And so the apology you wait for will likely never come. But knowing this intellectually does not stop the waiting. Because the waiting is not really about them. It is about you. About your need to have your experience validated, your harm acknowledged, your pain recognized as real and legitimate and worthy of apology. And when the person who caused the harm refuses to provide this, you are left trying to provide it for yourself, trying to tell yourself that you were hurt even if they will never admit it, that what happened was wrong even if they will never acknowledge it, that you deserved better even if they will never say so. And this self-validation, while necessary, never quite fills the space that their apology would have filled, because there is something about external acknowledgement that internal acknowledgement cannot replace. Something about having another person witness your pain and admit their role in it, that self-acknowledgement, no matter how compassionate, cannot provide. From a psychological standpoint, this makes sense. If harm is never acknowledged, it feels like it never mattered. And if it never mattered, then neither did you. So the apology becomes proof. Proof that what happened was real. Proof that you were not imagining it. Proof that you deserved better. Without this proof, your reality feels unstable. Your experience feels questionable. Your pain feels illegitimate, and so you need the validation, need the acknowledgement, need the apology. Not because it will undo the harm, but because it will confirm that the harm existed, that it was real, that it mattered, that you mattered. And when that confirmation never comes, you're left in a specific kind of psychological limbo, where your experience is real to you but unacknowledged by the world, where your pain exists but has no witness, where harm was done but no one admits to doing it. And this limbo is its own form of suffering, a suffering that has no clear resolution, because the resolution requires someone else, someone who may never care enough to provide it. There is also a specific type of rumination that comes from unanswered questions, not the productive kind of thinking, not problem solving or reflection or processing, but mental loops that never resolve. The mind replays the same events over and over, analyzing them from every angle, looking for the piece of information that will make everything make sense. And each time it replays, it notices something new, some small detail that might be significant, some word choice that could reveal meaning, some shift in tone that might explain what happened. And the mind grabs onto these details, tests theories, constructs explanations, and for a moment it feels like progress, like understanding is close, like the answer is finally within reach. But then the theory falls apart, the explanation does not quite fit, and the mind goes back to the beginning, replays the events again, looks for different clues, constructs different theories, and the cycle continues, endlessly, exhaustingly, compulsively. This rumination is not voluntary. It is not something the person chooses to do. It is automatic. The mind returning again and again to the unfinished business, to the question that was never answered, to the loop that was never closed, and each time it returns, it brings the same hope. Maybe this time I will figure it out. Maybe this time I will see what I missed. Maybe this time the pieces will click into place and everything will make sense. But it never does. The pieces never quite fit. The answer never quite appears. And so the mind tries again, and again, and again. And the person spends hours, days, years, replaying events that are long past, events that cannot be changed, events that will never be fully understood because the information required to understand them was never provided. But the mind does not accept this. The mind believes that with enough effort, enough analysis, enough time, the answer can be found. And so it keeps trying, keeps working, keeps searching. Even though the search yields nothing, even though the rumination brings only exhaustion, even though the answers will never come from replaying what already happened. The belief underlying this is clear. If I think about it enough, I will figure it out. If I analyze it thoroughly enough, I will understand. If I replay it one more time, I will see what I missed. This belief feels logical. It feels like determination, like persistence, like refusing to give up on understanding. But it is also a trap, because thinking about something does not create information that was never there. Analyzing an interaction does not reveal someone else's internal motivations. Replaying a conversation does not make the unsaid suddenly said. The information required to answer the question was never recorded. It exists only in the other person's mind, and no amount of analysis on your part can access it. But the ruminating mind does not accept this. It keeps trying, keeps hoping, keeps believing that the answer is hidden somewhere in the details, that if you just look hard enough, think hard enough, work hard enough, you will find it, but you will not, because it is not there. It never was. And so the rumination achieves nothing except exhaustion. It does not bring understanding. It does not bring closure. It does not bring peace. It just keeps the wound open, keeps the question active, keeps the person stuck in the past, replaying events that cannot be changed, searching for answers that cannot be found. And over time, the rumination becomes its own form of suffering. The person wakes up thinking about it, goes to sleep thinking about it, cannot focus on the present because the past is so loud, cannot engage with what is happening now because the mind is consumed with what happened then, and they know, on some level, that the ruminating is not helping, that it is making things worse, that they need to stop, but they cannot, because stopping feels like giving up, like accepting that they will never understand, and accepting that feels unbearable. This is not overthinking. It is the mind's desperate attempt to create resolution where none exists, to find the answer that will finally allow the question to rest. But the question cannot rest until it is answered. And if the answer never comes, the question never rests. It just keeps asking, keeps demanding, keeps consuming mental energy that could be used for other things. And the person becomes trapped in their own mind, trapped in the loop, trapped in the unanswered question, and escape requires something that feels impossible. It requires accepting that some questions will never be answered, that some events will never be understood, that some confusion will never resolve, and that thinking about it endlessly does not change this. It just keeps you stuck. Another subtle but powerful effect is how they relate to ambiguity in general. The inability to tolerate uncertainty in unanswered questions often extends to uncertainty everywhere. They need clarity in all situations. They need to know where they stand in every relationship. They need to understand the plan for every situation. They need definitions, labels, explanations, certainty. And when certainty is not available, they become anxious, uncomfortable, unable to rest. This shows up in relationships particularly. They need to know early what the relationship is, whether it is casual or serious, whether it is going somewhere or just temporary. They need the other person to define their intentions, to clarify their feelings, to provide certainty about the future, and this need for clarity feels urgent, not like a preference, but like a requirement, like something they must have in order to feel safe. The question, quote, "First, becomes not just a casual inquiry but an essential one, asked early, asked repeatedly, because not knowing what the relationship is feels dangerous, feels like the ambiguity that preceded loss in the past, and so they need it defined. They need it clear. They need to know exactly where they stand so they can protect themselves, so they can prepare, so they can prevent the confusion that comes when things end without explanation. But often, their urgency for clarity pushes the other person away, because not everything can be defined early. Not every relationship moves at the same pace. Not every person is ready to label something that is still developing, and the pressure to define, to clarify, to make certain what is still uncertain feels overwhelming, feels like too much too soon. And so the other person pulls back, and the person seeking clarity interprets this as confirmation. See, something was wrong. I needed to know. And the fact that they pulled away proves that clarity was necessary. They do not recognize that the pulling away happened because of the pressure, not because something was wrong initially, but because the demand for certainty created the very distance it was trying to prevent. This need for clarity is not about control. It is about safety, about preventing the ambiguity that once preceded pain, about knowing where you stand so you cannot be blindsided, about having information so you can protect yourself. And this makes sense. This is logical. This is the nervous system trying to prevent future harm by demanding clarity now. But the problem is that life is ambiguous. Relationships develop slowly. Feelings change. People need time. And the demand for certainty before certainty can naturally arise, often prevents the relationship from developing at all. Often pushes away the very person you're trying to hold on to. And so the pattern becomes self-defeating. The need for clarity born from past pain creates present pain, and the person is left, once again, in confusion, once again, without answers, once again waiting for an explanation that will never come. The internal logic is clear. Ambiguity equals danger. Clarity equals safety. If I do not know where I stand, I could be hurt at any moment. If I do not understand the situation, I cannot protect myself. If things are undefined, they could end without warning, and endings without warning are the thing I fear most, so I demand clarity. I press for definitions. I need to know, not eventually, now. Because waiting in ambiguity feels unbearable, feels like standing in the space where past pain lives, and I cannot do that again, cannot survive uncertainty again, cannot live in not knowing again. So I push, and the pushing creates the ending I was trying to prevent, and I am left, once more, with an unanswered question. Why did they leave? What went wrong? What did I do? And the cycle continues. Psychologically, this is the mind trying to prevent the limbo it once endured. If everything is clear, nothing can disappear without explanation. If everything is defined, nothing can end without reason. But life is not this neat, and the demand for certainty often pushes away the very clarity being sought, because certainty cannot be forced. Definitions cannot be rushed, and trying to make everything clear before it has time to develop naturally often prevents development altogether. But the person seeking clarity cannot see this, or if they see it intellectually, they cannot stop emotionally, because the fear of ambiguity is stronger than the fear of pushing. The need for certainty is more urgent than the need for patience. And so they choose pressing over waiting, choose demanding over trusting, choose the temporary relief of clarity, even if that clarity is quote 5 over the ongoing discomfort of quote 6, because quote 7 is where past pain lives, and they will do anything to avoid living there again. Another lasting imprint shows up in how they handle rejection. Rejection is painful for everyone, but for the person who waits for answers, rejection without explanation is uniquely unbearable. Rejection with explanation is painful but processable. It hurts. It is disappointing, but at least you understand. At least you know what went wrong. At least you can learn from it. At least the loop is closed. But rejection without explanation creates a wound that cannot heal, a question that cannot be answered, a loss that cannot be grieved. Because how do you grieve something you do not understand? How do you process something that was never explained? How do you learn from something that was never clarified? You cannot. And so the rejection remains active, remains open, remains consuming. Not because the rejection itself was so significant, but because the absence of explanation makes it impossible to process. Ghosting is the ultimate expression of this cruelty. Not just rejection, but rejection without acknowledgement, without conversation, without explanation, just silence where connection used to be. One day the person is there, the next day they are gone, and nothing is said, nothing is explained, nothing is clarified. The person waiting is left with nothing but questions. What happened? What did I do? Did I misread the connection? Was I imagining their interest? Did something change? Did I say something wrong? Did I move too fast, too slow? Was I too much? Not enough? The questions multiply, the theories accumulate, the rumination begins, and it does not stop, because there is no information to stop it, just silence, just absence, just the sudden, unexplained end of something that felt like it was beginning. The need to know what went wrong is not neediness, it is not weakness, it is the reasonable desire to understand what happened, to make sense of an ending, to know what went wrong so it can be learned from, to have the basic human respect of explanation when something ends. But when the other person refuses to provide this, when they simply disappear without a word, they leave you with nothing. Just confusion, just hurt, just the endless wondering, and that wondering becomes its own torture. Not because the rejection was so painful, but because the absence of explanation makes it impossible to file away, impossible to process, impossible to release, and so it stays, active, open, consuming more energy than the actual relationship ever did. Because the relationship, brief as it was, is over, but the question remains, and the question is louder, more persistent, more demanding than the relationship ever was. This is not neediness. It is the reasonable desire to understand what happened, to make sense of an ending, to know what went wrong so it can be learned from. But when the other person refuses to provide that, they are left with nothing, just silence. And silence answers nothing. It clarifies nothing. It resolves nothing. It just creates a void where understanding should be. And the person is left to fill that void themselves, with theories, with narratives, with assumptions. But none of it feels true. None of it brings the relief that an actual answer would bring, and so they wait. They hope that maybe the person will reach out eventually, will explain eventually, will provide the closure they withheld initially. But usually the explanation never comes, and the person is left to create their own closure, to decide for themselves what happened, to accept that they will never truly know. And this acceptance, This decision to move forward without understanding is one of the hardest things they will ever have to do, because everything in their psychology tells them that moving forward without understanding is dangerous, is irresponsible, is setting themselves up to repeat whatever mistake they made. But they have no choice, because the alternative is waiting forever. And waiting forever is not living. It is just existing in limbo, and at some point, the pain of limbo exceeds the pain of letting go, and they let go, not because they wanted to, but because they had to, because waiting was destroying them, and letting go, even without answers, was the only way to survive. From a neurological standpoint, the brain struggles uniquely with unanswered questions. There is a psychological phenomenon never named explicitly but well documented, where incomplete tasks remain more active in memory than completed ones. The brain remembers unfinished business better than finished business. It keeps returning to open loops more readily than closed ones. This is adaptive. This helps us remember to finish what we started, to follow through on commitments, to complete tasks we began. But it also means that unanswered questions stay mentally active in a way that answered questions do not. The brain keeps them near the surface, keeps returning to them, keeps trying to solve them, not because the person chooses this, but because the brain is designed to seek completion, to close loops, to finish what was started. And when loops cannot be closed, when questions cannot be answered, the brain does not simply file them away, it keeps them active, waiting for the information that will allow completion. This is why unanswered questions consume so much mental energy, why they are thought about more than answered questions, why they intrude at random moments, why they keep coming back no matter how much time passes. The brain is not being difficult. It is following its design. It keeps the question active because the question is unfinished. And unfinished things demand attention, demand mental resources, demand continued effort until they are resolved. This is helpful when the thing can actually be finished, when the question can actually be answered, when the loop can actually be closed. But when the question is fundamentally unanswerable, when the loop cannot be closed because the information required does not exist, the brain's design becomes a problem. It keeps working on something that cannot be solved, keeps returning to something that has no resolution, keeps demanding attention for something that will never be complete, and the person experiences this as obsession, as inability to let go, as being stuck. But it is not a personal failing. It is the brain doing what it was designed to do, and the design works beautifully when closure is possible. But when closure is impossible, the design keeps the person in a state of perpetual activation, perpetual seeking, perpetual incompletion. The relief that comes with any answer, even a bad one, demonstrates this clearly. When someone finally provides explanation, even if the explanation is painful, there is immediate relief, not because the content of the answer was what they wanted, but because the loop is closed. The question is answered. The brain can finally file it away as complete, and the mental energy that was being consumed by the unanswered question is suddenly freed, suddenly available for other things. This is why people often say that any answer is better than no answer, not because painful answers are enjoyable, but because the closure they provide is so desperately needed, because the mind cannot rest while questions remain open. And when questions are finally answered, even if the answer brings pain, the mind can finally rest. can finally release the question, can finally stop working on something that consumed resources without ever providing resolution. But when answers never arrive, the brain keeps the question open, keeps working on it, keeps trying to solve it, and the years pass, and the question remains active, and the person remains stuck, not because they lack willpower, not because they are weak, but because their brain is doing exactly what brains do, keeping unfinished business active, keeping unanswered questions near the surface, keeping incomplete loops demanding attention. And the only way to change this is to somehow convince the brain that the loop is closed even without external completion, to create internal closure where external closure was never provided, to tell the brain that the question, while unanswered, can be set down. That completion is not always possible, that moving forward without resolution is allowed, and this is difficult. This goes against the brain's design. This requires overriding a deeply embedded system, but it is possible, and it is necessary. Because waiting for external completion that will never come means staying stuck forever. And eventually, the pain of being stuck exceeds the fear of moving forward without answers, and the person chooses movement, chooses to close the loop themselves, chooses to tell their brain that while the question was never answered, the waiting is over, and slowly, gradually, the brain begins to comply, begins to release the question, begins to free the energy that was bound up in the unanswered, and healing, finally, becomes possible. The nervous system is not being difficult. It is following its natural design. Questions are meant to be answered. Stories are meant to have endings. Conflicts are meant to resolve. And when they do not, the brain keeps them open, waiting, always waiting, for the information that will allow completion. And when that information never comes, the waiting becomes permanent, unless the person intervenes, unless they decide consciously, deliberately, that they are closing the loop themselves, that they are answering the question with quote 8, that they are ending the story with quote 9, that they are resolving the conflict with quote 10, and these closures, while painful, while unsatisfying, are still closures. And closure, however imperfect, is better than permanent limbo, better than endless waiting, better than a life consumed by questions that will never be answered. There is also a specific relationship these individuals develop with the past. Most people can close chapters of their life, can look back on what happened and see it as past, as complete, as something that belongs to an earlier time. But for the person who waits for answers, the past is never fully past. It remains active, present, unfinished. Because how can something be past when you do not understand what happened? How can a chapter be closed when you do not know how it ended? How can a relationship be truly over when you never understood why it ended? And so the past lingers, not as memory, but as unfinished business, as something that is still happening, in a sense, because it was never completed. And this creates a specific kind of stuck, not depression, not avoidance, but a particular inability to fully release what ended without explanation. This shows up in how they relate to time. The past is not something they occasionally reflect on. It is something they actively inhabit. They think about it daily. They replay it regularly. They cannot seem to leave it behind, not because they enjoy dwelling, not because they are choosing to stay stuck, but because the past feels unfinished, and unfinished things demand attention, demand presence, demand continued engagement, and so they engage. They think about the person who left. They analyze what happened. They wonder what went wrong. They create theories. They search for closure. And years pass, 5 years, 10 years, and they are still thinking about it, still trying to understand, still waiting for the answer that will finally allow them to let it go. And they know, intellectually, that this is not healthy, that they should have moved on by now, that the past should be past, but it does not feel past. It feels present. It feels active, it feels unfinished, and until it feels finished, they cannot seem to release it. This inability to release the past prevents full presence in the present. 1 foot always in what was, 1 foot tentatively in what is, never fully here, never fully now. Always divided between the current moment and the unresolved past. And this division affects everything. It affects new relationships because the past relationship is still active, still taking up space, still consuming energy. It affects current decisions because past confusion makes present choices feel uncertain. It affects future plans because the future cannot be fully embraced while the past is still unresolved. And so the person lives in a strange kind of suspension, neither in the past nor fully in the present, neither letting go nor moving forward, just waiting, always waiting, for the past to finally become past, for the confusion to finally resolve, for the answers to finally arrive so that life can finally continue. The fantasy that drives this waiting is specific. One day, the person will reach out. One day they will explain. One day everything will make sense. One day the past will finally have an ending, and when that day comes, healing can begin. Moving forward can happen. The future can be entered. But until that day comes, all the person can do is wait, and maintain, and keep the door open, just in case the person returns, just in case the explanation finally arrives, just in case the confusion finally resolves. This fantasy feels reasonable. It feels like leaving space for healing, but it is actually preventing healing. Because healing does not require their explanation. Healing does not require their return. Healing requires letting go. And letting go requires accepting that the explanation may never come, that the person may never return, that the confusion may never fully resolve, and that life must continue anyway. But accepting this feels like giving up, like admitting defeat, like saying that the pain did not matter enough to understand, and so they do not accept it. They hold on to the fantasy, and the fantasy keeps them waiting, and the waiting keeps them stuck, and the years pass, and nothing changes, because change requires releasing what never got resolved, and releasing feels impossible. This is not living in the past by choice. It is being held there by unanswered questions. The past cannot become past until it is understood, and when understanding never comes, the past remains present, active, unfinished, waiting to be resolved, and the person cannot seem to move forward until resolution happens. But resolution is not coming, and so they remain in limbo, in confusion, in waiting, and this becomes their life, not by choice, but because the absence of answers makes closure impossible. And without closure, the past will not stay past. It keeps returning, keeps demanding attention, keeps insisting on resolution, And until the person finds a way to provide resolution themselves, without external answers, they will remain stuck, and their life will be lived in the shadow of what was never explained, what was never finished, what was never understood. Another area where this psychology becomes visible is in new relationships. The pattern does not stay in the past. It comes forward, into the present, into new connections, into interactions with people who had nothing to do with the original unanswered questions. But the person brings the pattern with them, brings the need for clarity, the fear of ambiguity, the compulsion to prevent future confusion by demanding answers now. And this shows up as intensity, as neediness, as an inability to simply let relationships develop naturally. They over-communicate. They ask constant questions. They need regular reassurance. They check in frequently. They demand to know where things stand. They press for definitions early. And all of this comes from a reasonable place, from a history where ambiguity preceded loss, where lack of clarity meant something bad was coming, where unanswered questions meant relationships were ending. And so they try to prevent this, try to catch problems early, try to address confusion before it becomes permanent, but their intensity often creates what it is trying to prevent. New partners experience this as pressure, as anxiety, as too much too soon. The constant need for reassurance feels exhausting. The frequent requests for clarity feel premature. The inability to tolerate normal gaps in communication feels clingy. And so they pull back. Not because anything was wrong initially, but because the demand for constant clarity, constant contact, constant reassurance becomes overwhelming. And the person seeking answers interprets this pulling back as confirmation of their fears. See, something was wrong. I knew it. I needed to know. And the fact that they pulled away proves that my vigilance was necessary. They do not recognize that the vigilance itself created the problem, that the constant checking pushed the person away, that the need for answers scared off the very person they wanted answers from, and so the pattern reinforces itself. They become more vigilant, more demanding, more insistent on clarity. And this pushes people further away, and they interpret this as evidence that people are untrustworthy, that relationships are dangerous, that clarity is necessary, and the cycle continues. The question, quotidian levnest, becomes something they ask frequently, after every small conflict, after every brief silence, after every perceived shift in energy. They need constant confirmation that nothing is wrong, that the relationship is still secure, that the person is not pulling away, and the first few times, the other person reassures them, of course we are okay, nothing is wrong. But after the 10th time, the 20th time, the reassurance starts to feel hollow, because clearly they are not okay. Clearly something is wrong, and what is wrong is that the person cannot trust the reassurance, cannot believe the relationship is secure, cannot rest in connection. They need proof, need evidence, need constant validation that what they fear is not happening. And this constant need becomes its own problem, becomes the thing that destabilizes the relationship, becomes the thing that makes eventually become answered with. The urgency for clarity that feels so necessary to the person seeking it feels like pressure to the person receiving it. Relationships need time, they need space, they need ambiguity, they need the freedom to develop at their own pace, without being forced into definitions before definitions are ready. And when someone cannot tolerate this ambiguity, when they press for certainty before certainty can naturally emerge, they often prevent the relationship from developing at all, because the other person feels trapped, feels pressured, feels like they have to make decisions before they are ready. And rather than make premature decisions, they often choose to leave, and the person seeking clarity is left, once again with an unanswered question. What went wrong? Why did they leave? What did I do? And they do not see that their need for answers was what went wrong, that their inability to tolerate ambiguity was what pushed the person away, that their urgency for clarity was the problem. They only see that, once again, someone left without full explanation. Once again, they are stuck with confusion. Once again, they are waiting for answers that will not come. Psychologically, this makes sense. The nervous system is trying to prevent future pain by demanding clarity now. But the demand for answers before they naturally arrive often creates the very distance they fear, because clarity cannot be forced, and trying to force it usually pushes it further away. But the person cannot stop, cannot slow down, cannot trust the process, because trusting the process means tolerating ambiguity, and ambiguity is what they have been trying to avoid their entire life. Ambiguity is where the danger lives, where the pain comes from, where the unanswered questions originate. And so they refuse ambiguity. They demand clarity. They insist on knowing. And in doing so, they create the endings they fear. They push away the people they want to hold on to. They guarantee future confusion through their desperate attempt to prevent it. And the pattern repeats. And they do not understand why. Because from their perspective, they are just trying to protect themselves, just trying to prevent future pain, just trying to get the answers they need to feel safe. They do not see that the answers they seek cannot be given on their timeline, cannot be forced, cannot be demanded, that relationships require patience, require trust, require the ability to not know and still move forward. And this ability is precisely what they lack, and so they remain stuck in the pattern, creating the thing they fear, losing people through the very means they use to try to keep them. From a psychological standpoint, there is also a specific type of grief that surfaces later in life. Not the grief of a specific loss, not the grief of a relationship ending or a person leaving, but a more diffuse grief, a grief of accumulated unanswered questions, a grief of all the times understanding was withheld, a grief of all the endings that were never explained, a grief of all the years spent waiting for closure that never came. This grief does not attach to one moment, it attaches to a pattern, to a lifetime of confusion, to the accumulated weight of never being given the basic respect of explanation. And this grief is heavy, heavier than grief that has a clear source. Because this grief is everywhere. It is in every unanswered question, in every unexplained ending, in every moment where someone went silent and you never knew why. This grief often arrives unexpectedly, in moments of calm, in moments when nothing particularly bad is happening. It surfaces as a heaviness that has no clear cause, as tears that appear for no obvious reason, as a sadness that cannot be traced to one event but seems to permeate everything, and the person feels confused. Why am I so sad when nothing is wrong? Why am I grieving when nothing has been lost recently? Why does this feel so heavy when I cannot even identify what this is? But the grief is real. It is the grief of ambiguous loss, the grief of things that ended without explanation, the grief of confusion that was never resolved, the grief of being left in limbo repeatedly. And this grief, while diffuse, is legitimate. It matters. It deserves to be acknowledged, not rushed through, not explained away, not dismissed as oversensitivity, but honoured as the natural response to a lifetime of unanswered questions. Psychologically, this is called grieving ambiguous loss. An ambiguous loss is the hardest to heal because the mind cannot fully grieve what it cannot fully understand. Clear loss has an ending point. You grieve, you process, you eventually move forward. But ambiguous loss has no ending point. It lingers, it resurfaces, it never quite completes. Because how do you grieve something that was never explained? How do you process something that was never acknowledged? How do you release something that was never finished? You cannot. Not in the traditional way, so the grief remains, sometimes quiet, sometimes loud, but always there, waiting, like everything else, for the closure that will finally allow it to complete. But the closure does not come, and so the grief continues. Not constant, not overwhelming every day, but present, beneath the surface, ready to emerge when triggered, ready to remind you that what happened mattered, that the lack of answers hurt, that you deserved better, and that you are still, in some way, waiting. But here is the part most people miss about those who wait for answers. They did not just lose something, they also developed something. Through all the confusion, all the waiting, all the unanswered questions, they built capacities that many people never develop. They learned analysis. They learned to notice details others overlook. They learned to read between lines, to detect patterns, to see what is not said as clearly as what is said. They became skilled observers, skilled questioners, skilled at seeking truth beneath surface presentations, and these are real skills, valuable skills, skills that make them good investigators, good researchers, good analysts, because they do not accept easy answers. They dig deeper, they ask why, they refuse to settle for superficial explanations, and this capacity, while born from pain, is genuine. It is not just a wound, it is also a gift, a way of engaging with the world that is thoughtful, thorough, persistent. They also developed a deep appreciation for clarity, for honesty, for people who explain themselves. They value communication. They value people who finish conversations, who provide closure, who answer questions, who respect the need for understanding. And when they encounter these people, they hold on to them, because they know how rare this is, how precious, how healing, to be with someone who does not leave you guessing, who does not make you wait, who gives you the answers you need without you having to beg for them. This appreciation runs deep. It shapes who they choose, who they trust, who they let close. They have no patience for ambiguous people, for people who disappear, for people who go silent, for people who refuse to explain themselves. They have lived that pattern too many times, and they will not accept it anymore, and so they seek people who are clear, who are direct, who are honest, and when they find these people, they cherish them, because they understand the gift that clarity is, the gift that explanation provides, the gift of not being left in confusion. But analysis without acceptance becomes paralysis, and understanding without closure becomes obsession. So the gifts are real, and so is the cost. The capacity to analyze deeply becomes the inability to stop analyzing. The appreciation for clarity becomes the inability to tolerate ambiguity. The skill of noticing patterns becomes the compulsion to find patterns even where none exist. And so the gifts that came from pain also perpetuate pain. The strengths that developed as adaptations also become limitations. And healing requires recognizing both, honoring the capacities that were built, and also recognizing when those capacities become compulsions, when analysis becomes rumination, when seeking truth becomes refusing to accept that some truths are unknowable, when the strength becomes the thing that keeps you stuck. And this recognition is difficult, because the gifts feel earned, feel like the one good thing that came from the pain, and setting them down, even when they no longer serve you, feels like betraying yourself, like giving up the only thing you gained from suffering. But setting them down does not erase what they gave you. It just allows you to choose when to use them and when to rest. Healing for the person who waits for answers does not mean giving up on understanding. It does not mean becoming someone who does not care about truth. It does not mean accepting confusion happily. It means something different. It means learning that not all questions can be answered, not all confusion can be resolved, not all endings can be explained, and that life can continue anyway, that healing can happen without external closure, that moving forward is possible even when the past remains unclear. This is not easy. This goes against everything they learned, everything that kept them safe, everything that helped them survive, the belief that understanding is necessary, that clarity is essential, that questions must be answered before progress can happen. But these beliefs, while they once served them, now trap them. Now keep them waiting for something that will never come. Now prevent the healing that could happen if they would just let go of the requirement for external answers. Healing is not about getting the answers you were denied. It is about learning that your life can continue without them, that you can close chapters without understanding every page, that you can move forward without complete information, that you can create internal closure where external closure was never provided. And this shift from waiting for answers to creating your own sense of completion is the core of healing. It is not giving up on truth. It is accepting that some truths will never be known, that some questions will never be answered, that some people will never explain themselves, and that you cannot spend your life waiting for what they will never give. That your healing cannot be contingent on their willingness to provide clarity, that you must find a way forward without them, without their explanation, without their closure, without their participation in your healing. And this is hard. This feels like settling, like accepting less than you deserve, but it is not settling. It is choosing yourself, choosing your life, choosing your future over their silence. And that is not giving up. That is healing. This is not giving up. It is accepting that some questions will never be answered, and that life can continue anyway, not perfectly, not without grief, but forward. And forward is the direction that matters. Forward is where healing happens. Forward is where life exists. And staying in the past, waiting for answers that will not come, is not living. It is existing in suspension. It is waiting for permission to move on from someone who will never grant it. And at some point, you have to grant that permission yourself. You have to decide that the waiting is over. not because the answers arrived, but because you are choosing to move forward without them. And this decision, this choice to close the loop yourself, is one of the most powerful things you can do. It is taking back control, taking back your life, taking back your future from the person who took your past. And it is hard, and it is painful, and it feels wrong, but it is also necessary, and it is possible, and it is the only way forward. One of the most important steps is learning to distinguish between closure and certainty. Most people use these words interchangeably, but they are not the same. Certainty is knowing exactly what happened and why. Certainty is having all the answers, understanding all the details, having complete information. But closure is something different. Closure is the decision to stop waiting for certainty. Closure is the acceptance that you will never know everything. Closure is the choice to move forward anyway, and closure is possible without certainty. You can close a chapter without understanding every page. You can end your part of the story even when their part is unfinished. You can decide it is done without their agreement. And this is where healing begins, in the recognition that closure is internal, that it is something you create, not something you receive. This is hard to accept, because everything in your history tells you that closure comes from outside, that answers must be given by the person who created the questions, that understanding must come from the source of confusion. And while external closure is ideal, while it is what you deserve, it is not always possible. And making your healing dependent on receiving it means making your healing dependent on someone else's willingness. Someone who has already shown they are unwilling. Someone who has already demonstrated they do not care enough to provide explanation. And giving them this power, giving them control over whether you can move forward, is giving them too much. They took your past by leaving without explanation. Do not give them your future by refusing to move forward until they explain. Take your future back. Take your healing back. Take your closure back and create it yourself. Not because they do not owe you answers, they do, but because waiting for them to pay what they owe is costing you more than the debt is worth. External answers do not always bring the closure we expect. Sometimes the answer, when it finally arrives, is underwhelming, or confusing, or creates more questions. Sometimes the explanation does not match the story you constructed. Sometimes it reveals that there was no deep reason, no significant cause, just indifference, just distraction, just lack of care. And sometimes that is worse than not knowing. Sometimes the answer is it did not matter enough to explain. You did not matter enough to explain. And while this is information, while it is technically the answer you were waiting for, it does not bring peace. It brings a different kind of pain. The pain of being confirmed in your irrelevance to them. The pain of knowing that the confusion that consumed you for years was not even significant enough for them to address. And so sometimes, getting the answer you waited for does not heal you. It just shifts the pain. From the pain of not knowing to the pain of knowing you did not matter. This is why closure must be internal, because external closure is unreliable. It may never come, and when it does come, it may not help. And making your healing depend on something this unreliable is not wise. It is not self-protective. It is giving your power away. So you must learn to close things yourself, to decide for yourself that it is done, to create your own narrative that allows movement, And this narrative does not have to be certain. It does not have to be complete. It does not have to match their truth. It just has to be enough. Enough to allow you to stop waiting. Enough to allow you to move forward. Enough to allow you to live. And sometimes the narrative is as simple as I will never know. And I am choosing to move forward anyway. And that is enough. That is closure. Not the closure you wanted, not the closure you deserved, but closure nonetheless. And closure, however imperfect, is better than waiting forever. This does not mean the questions do not matter. It means waiting for external answers to internal questions keeps you frozen. The closure you need may not come from them. It may only come from you. And you giving yourself permission to move forward without their explanation is not giving up. It is taking responsibility for your own healing. It is recognizing that they do not get to hold your future hostage just because they refuse to explain your past. It is choosing yourself, choosing your peace, choosing your life. And that is not betrayal. That is self-respect. That is understanding that you matter, that your healing matters, that your life matters, more than their explanation, more than their closure, more than their participation in your recovery. You matter more than their answers, and acting like you matter means moving forward, even when they refuse to help you do it. Another crucial step is learning to tolerate ambiguity. This is one of the hardest things for someone who waited for answers to learn, because ambiguity is where the pain lives. Ambiguity is what preceded every unanswered question. Ambiguity is the feeling they have been trying to avoid their entire life. But avoiding ambiguity is impossible. Life is ambiguous. Relationships are ambiguous. People are ambiguous. And the attempt to eliminate all ambiguity, to demand certainty in all situations, creates more problems than it solves. So healing requires learning to sit with not knowing, learning to tolerate the discomfort of uncertainty, learning that not everything needs to be understood immediately, that some things can remain unclear, that you can function, can live, can be okay, even when you do not have all the answers. And this learning is slow, it is uncomfortable, it goes against every instinct, but it is necessary. Practicing ambiguity tolerance starts small, with small uncertainties, with small moments of not knowing, a text that goes unanswered for a few hours, sitting with the anxiety instead of immediately checking, noticing the discomfort, noticing the urge to fill the gap, and choosing not to, choosing to wait, choosing to tolerate the not knowing. And nothing bad happens. The person responds eventually, and you learn slowly that ambiguity does not always mean danger, that gaps do not always mean loss, that silence does not always mean ending. And each time you survive ambiguity, your nervous system integrates new information that contradicts the old belief. That says uncertainty is not always threatening. That says not knowing is not always dangerous. That says you can tolerate discomfort without needing immediate resolution. And over time, with practice, with repetition, ambiguity becomes more bearable, not comfortable, but bearable, tolerable, something you can sit with without spiraling. The practice extends to larger uncertainties, to relationships that are undefined, to situations that lack clarity, to questions that remain unanswered. And instead of immediately pressing for resolution, you pause, you notice the discomfort, you acknowledge the urge to seek clarity, and then you choose deliberately to wait. Not forever, not passively, but for a reasonable time, to see if clarity emerges naturally, to see if patience yields what pressure could not. And sometimes it does. Sometimes waiting provides what demanding would have prevented, and you learn that not all ambiguity needs to be resolved immediately, that some things clarify themselves if given time, that your urgency, while it feels necessary, often creates the problems it is trying to prevent. And this learning is gradual. It is not one realization. It is hundreds of small moments where you choose tolerance over demand, where you choose patience over pressure, where you choose trust over control, and each moment teaches you something, teaches you that you can survive not knowing. That uncertainty, while uncomfortable, is not catastrophic, that life can continue even when things are unclear, and slowly the tolerance builds, not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to allow relationships to develop naturally, enough to prevent the urgency that pushes people away, enough to live with some degree of peace in an ambiguous world. Tolerating ambiguity does not mean liking it. It means no longer letting it control you. It means you can sit with not knowing and still function, still move forward, still live, while the question remains unanswered. And this is freedom, not from the discomfort, but from the compulsion, from the urgency, from the belief that you cannot move forward until everything is clear. You can, you always could, but you believed you could not, and that belief kept you waiting, kept you stuck, kept you frozen. And learning to tolerate ambiguity means unlearning that belief, means teaching yourself through repeated experience that not knowing is survivable, that you can live in uncertainty, that your life does not require perfect clarity to be worth living. And this learning, this gradual increase in tolerance, opens doors that were previously closed, doors to relationships that need time, doors to experiences that require trust, doors to a life that is not perfectly clear but is still worth living. And walking through those doors means accepting that some questions will never be answered, that some things will never be understood, that ambiguity is part of life. And life, even with ambiguity, is still life. And it is yours to live, with or without answers. There is also a specific healing that happens when you stop asking why. Why is the question that keeps you stuck? Why did they leave? Why did it end? Why did they go silent? Why did this happen? These questions feel necessary. They feel like the path to understanding. They feel like what you need to ask in order to heal. But why keeps you focused on the past? Keeps you looking backward? Keeps you trying to understand what cannot be changed? And while understanding is valuable, while it can provide insight, it cannot change what happened. It cannot undo the ending. It cannot bring back what was lost. And so, why, while it feels productive, often just keeps you circling, keeps you analyzing, keeps you stuck in what was instead of moving toward what could be. And healing requires a different question. Not why did this happen, but what now? Not why did they leave, but how do I move forward? Not why did it end, but what do I want my life to look like now? This shift from why to what now is crucial, because why keeps you dependent on external information, on answers you may never receive, on understanding that may never come, but what now is entirely within your control. What now does not require their participation, does not require their explanation, does not require their presence. What now is about you, about your choices, about your life, about the future you want to build. And this question can be answered by you, right now, without waiting, without external input, without permission. And this is empowering. This takes your power back. This makes your healing your responsibility, not theirs, not dependent on them, not waiting for them, but yours, fully, completely, independently. And while why may never be answered, what now can be and must be, because what now is the question that creates the future, that allows movement, that enables healing. Sometimes there is no why, or the why does not matter, or the why is too simple to satisfy. They left because they wanted to. It ended because it was not working for them. They went silent because they did not care enough to explain. These are answers, but they are not the kind of answers that bring peace. They do not provide the deep understanding you sought. They do not reveal a reason you can learn from. They just confirm what you feared, that it was not about anything you did. It was about their choice, their priorities, their lack of investment. And knowing this does not help, does not heal, does not provide the closure you imagined it would. So sometimes the why does not matter. Sometimes what matters is accepting that it ended, that it hurt, that you deserved better, and that you are moving forward anyway. Without understanding, without closure, without their participation, because your life is more important than their explanation. Your healing is more important than their reasons. Your future is more important than understanding your past. And releasing the why allows you to focus on what actually matters, which is what now, which is forward, which is life. This often feels uncomfortable at first, not because something is wrong, but because asking why has been your way of making sense of pain. And releasing that question feels like releasing your only tool for understanding. But the question was never a tool, it was a weight, and setting it down is not giving up. It is choosing to move forward. It is recognizing that understanding, while valuable, is not more important than living. That your need for answers, while legitimate, cannot be more important than your need to heal. That waiting for external explanation is less important than creating internal peace. And this shift from seeking external answers to creating internal resolution is what allows healing to finally begin. What allows the past to finally become past. What allows the future to finally open. And that opening, that movement, that forward direction is everything. It is not the healing you wanted, not the closure you deserved, but it is healing nonetheless. And it is yours, and it is available right now, without their permission, without their explanation, without their presence. You can move forward, you can heal, you can live without them, without their answers, without the closure they refuse to give. And that is not defeat. That is strength. That is choosing yourself when they would not choose you. That is honoring your life when they would not honor your confusion. That is healing on your terms, and that is powerful. Another essential part of healing is learning to grieve without closure. This seems impossible. How do you grieve something you do not understand? How do you process a loss that was never explained? How do you honor an ending that never had a proper conclusion? But grieving without closure is not only possible, it is necessary. Because closure, as we have established, may never come. And if you wait for closure before you grieve, you will wait forever. And waiting forever means never processing, never healing, never moving forward. So you must learn to grieve anyway. To grieve the relationship even though you do not know why it ended. To grieve the friendship even though you do not know what went wrong. To grieve the loss even though you do not understand the reason. And this grieving is harder. It is more complicated. It is less linear. But it is still grieving. And grieving, however incomplete, is better than avoiding. Better than waiting. Better than staying stuck in confusion. Grieving without closure means acknowledging what ended even if you do not know why. Means allowing yourself to feel sad about the loss even though the loss was never explained. It means recognizing that the pain is real even if the reason remains unclear. And this acknowledgement is important because the pain does not need justification to exist. The loss does not need explanation to matter. The ending does not need understanding to be grieved. It happened, it hurt, it matters, and that is enough. Enough to warrant grief, enough to deserve processing, enough to honor with sadness, and giving yourself permission to grieve, even without understanding, is an act of self-compassion. It is saying my pain matters even when it is not explained. My loss is real even when it is not acknowledged by the person who caused it. My experience is valid even when it is questioned by my own mind. And this self-validation, this internal witnessing, begins the process of healing that external validation was supposed to provide but never did. The grief will not look like typical grief. It will be mixed with confusion, with anger, with questions, with theories, with the ongoing desire to understand. But underneath all of that is real grief, real sadness about what ended, real loss of what could have been, real pain about how it happened, and that grief deserves space, deserves time, deserves to be felt fully even though it cannot be understood fully. And allowing it, sitting with it, crying through it, is not weakness. It is healing. It is the slow release of what was held too long. The slow softening of what was frozen in confusion. The slow movement through what waiting prevented you from entering. And each time you grieve, each time you cry, each time you allow the sadness without demanding understanding first, you are healing. Not completing healing, not finishing healing, but moving through it, progressing, releasing, slowly, gradually, imperfectly, but genuinely. Grieving without closure doesn't mean you've accepted the silence. It means you've accepted that the silence won't stop you from healing, that you can honor the loss without understanding it, that grief is allowed even when the story is incomplete. And this permission, this allowance, opens something that waiting kept closed. It opens your heart to its own pain, opens your mind to its own needs, opens your life to its own future. And that opening, while painful, is also healing, is also necessary, is also the beginning of something new, something that does not require their explanation. Something that exists independent of their closure, something that is yours, your grief, your healing, your life, moving forward, finally, slowly, gently, but forward. From a neurological standpoint, the healing process requires new neural patterns. The brain spent years being trained that unanswered questions must be pursued. That ambiguity must be resolved. That closure must be obtained. These neural pathways are deep. They are automatic. They fire without conscious thought, and changing them requires something the brain resists. It requires building new pathways. Pathways that say unanswered questions can be set down, that ambiguity can be tolerated, that closure can be created internally. And building these pathways takes time, takes repetition, takes consistent practice of new behaviours even when those behaviours feel wrong. The brain will resist, will keep pulling you back to the old patterns, will keep insisting that questions must be answered. But slowly, with practice, with repetition, new pathways strengthen. And old pathways, while they never disappear completely, become less dominant, less automatic, less controlling. The process is not quick. The brain changes slowly, particularly patterns learned in childhood, patterns reinforced over decades. These do not shift with one decision. They shift with hundreds of small choices, hundreds of moments where you choose differently, where you choose to stop analysing, to stop seeking, to stop waiting. And each choice, each moment of choosing differently strengthens the new pathway, makes it slightly easier next time, slightly more automatic, and over time, months, sometimes years, the new pattern becomes strong enough to compete with the old one. You still feel the urge to seek answers, but the urge is weaker. You still notice unanswered questions, but they consume you less. You still wonder why. But the wondering does not control you. And this gradual weakening of old patterns and strengthening of new ones is healing at the neural level, is the brain learning that survival is possible without perfect understanding, that life can continue without perfect clarity, that you can be okay even when things remain unanswered. And this learning, this neural updating is what makes the psychological healing sustainable, makes the changes lasting, makes the healing real. The mind can learn to tolerate what it once could not. But learning takes time. The brain spent years being trained that unanswered questions are threats. Teaching it that unanswered questions can simply exist without resolution, without crisis, is slow work, but possible work. And the possibility is what matters. The understanding that you are not permanently broken, not forever stuck, not unable to change. You can change, you can learn, you can build new patterns. It just takes time. Takes patience with yourself, takes compassion for the slowness, takes an understanding that healing is not linear, that some days you will be fine with ambiguity and some days you will spiral, that some days you will be able to let go and some days you will obsessively analyse. And all of this is normal. All of this is part of the process. And the process, however slow, however imperfect, is still process, still movement, still healing, and that is enough. One of the most healing experiences is receiving an answer, even years later. Sometimes the person does reach out. Sometimes the explanation does arrive. Sometimes years after the ending, clarity comes, and when this happens, it is profound. Not always in the way expected, not always bringing the relief imagined, but profound nonetheless. Because the question that consumed so much energy is finally answered. The loop that stayed open is finally closed. The confusion that remained active is finally resolved. And there is relief in this, even if the answer is painful. Even if the explanation confirms your worst fears, even if the reason is stupid or trivial, or reveals that you did not matter as much as you thought, there is still relief, because the not knowing is over, the waiting is done, the question is answered, and the mind can finally file it away as complete. But what often surprises people is that the answer does not feel the way they expected. They imagined that getting the answer would heal everything, would bring immediate peace, would allow them to move forward suddenly and completely. But usually the answer is anticlimactic. It is underwhelming. It does not provide the profound insight they hoped for. It does not change the past. It does not undo the years of waiting. It does not retroactively make the confusion less painful. It is just information. Information they wanted. Information they needed, but information nonetheless. And information alone does not heal. It clarifies, but it does not erase. And so, they are left with clarity, but not necessarily peace. With understanding, but not necessarily closure. With the answer, but not necessarily relief. And this is confusing, because they spent so long believing that the answer was what they needed, that once they understood, everything would be better. But now they understand, and they are not entirely better. They are just differently situated, with information instead of without it, but still carrying the weight of what happened, still processing the loss, still healing from the years of confusion. Sometimes the answer is worse than not knowing. Sometimes the reason is they just did not care enough to explain, or they were too cowardly to have the conversation, or they moved on so quickly that you were not even a consideration. And these answers, while they provide closure, also hurt. They hurt in a new way. The pain of being confirmed in your irrelevance. The pain of knowing that what consumed you for years barely registered for them. The pain of understanding that the closure you needed was so unimportant to them that they could not be bothered to provide it until now, years later, when it no longer matters to them whether you have it or not. And this knowledge does not heal. It wounds differently. It shifts the pain from confusion to insignificance, from not knowing why to knowing that you did not matter enough for them to care. And sometimes that is harder to accept than the not knowing was. But even when the answer hurts, even when it is underwhelming, even when it does not bring the healing you expected, it does provide something important. It confirms that you were strong enough to survive without it, that you moved forward anyway, that you did the work of healing without their help, that the closure you created for yourself was real, was valid, was enough. And maybe, looking back, you realize that the healing happened not when the answer arrived, but in all the moments before. In all the times you chose to move forward without understanding. In all the times you grieved without closure. In all the times you lived your life even though the question remained unanswered. The answer did not heal you. You healed yourself. And the answer just confirmed that you were capable of healing without it. And that confirmation, that recognition of your own strength, is perhaps more valuable than any explanation they could have given, because it proves that your healing was never dependent on them, that you had the power all along, that you just needed to learn to access it, to trust it, to believe that you could close the loop yourself. And you did. And the answer arriving now does not diminish that. It just validates what you already accomplished. Getting the answer you waited for does not erase the years you spent waiting. But it does confirm something important, that you survived the not knowing, that you moved forward anyway, that the closure you found without them was real, and maybe more powerful than the answer itself, because the answer came from outside, but the healing came from within, and what comes from within is what lasts, is what sustains, is what makes you realize that you were never as dependent on their explanation as you believed, that you had the capacity for healing all along. You just had to learn to access it without external permission. And you did. And that is everything. Another important part of healing is learning to set boundaries around seeking. There is a difference between attempting once to get answers and obsessively pursuing them. There is a difference between asking directly and creating elaborate schemes to extract information. There is a difference between healthy closure-seeking and self-destructive fixation. And healing requires learning to recognize when seeking has become harmful, when it has crossed from legitimate desire for understanding into obsessive compulsion, when it has moved from occasional attempt into constant preoccupation, and when seeking crosses these lines, it is time to set boundaries with yourself about how much energy you will pour into pursuit, about how many times you will ask, about when you will stop. This is difficult because the urge to seek is powerful, the need to know is intense, and setting boundaries around seeking feels like giving up, like admitting defeat, like accepting that you do not matter enough to pursue understanding. But it is not any of those things. It is recognizing that your time, your energy, your mental health, your life matter more than their explanation. It is understanding that seeking can become its own form of self-harm, that pursuing someone who refuses to answer is damaging to you, that waiting for something that will not come is wasting your life. And so you set boundaries. You decide, I will ask once, or I will try this way, or I will pursue for this amount of time, and then I will stop. Not because I do not deserve answers, but because I deserve peace. And peace will not come from endless seeking. It will come from stopping, from accepting, from choosing myself over the answer. And that choice, that boundary is self-protection, is self-love, is recognizing that you matter enough to stop harming yourself in pursuit of understanding from someone who does not care enough to provide it. Knowing when to stop is a skill, and it is learned through trial and error, through pursuing too long and recognizing the harm it caused, through pushing too hard and driving people further away, through seeking obsessively and realizing it brought no clarity, only exhaustion. And each time you learn, each time you recognize the point where seeking became harmful, and slowly you calibrate. You learn when to try and when to stop, when to pursue and when to let go, when to seek and when to accept. And this calibration is not perfect. You will sometimes stop too soon. You will sometimes pursue too long. But over time, you learn. You learn to recognize the signs that seeking is no longer productive, the signs that pursuit has become obsession, the signs that you are harming yourself more than helping yourself. And when you see these signs, you stop. Not because you do not care, but because you care enough about yourself to protect yourself from the harm that seeking causes. And that stopping is not weakness. It is wisdom. It is self-respect. It is honoring yourself enough to know when to let go. Setting boundaries around seeking doesn't mean you don't care about understanding. It means you care more about your well-being than about answers that may never come. It means you value your peace more than their explanation. And that is not weakness. That is wisdom. It is recognizing that some battles are not worth fighting, that some questions are not worth pursuing, that some people are not worth seeking, not because the answers do not matter, but because your life matters more, your healing matters more, your peace matters more, and protection of yourself, protection of your energy, protection of your future is more important than understanding your past. And choosing yourself, choosing to stop seeking, choosing to set the question down, is choosing life. is choosing forward, is choosing healing, and that is everything. There is also a specific healing that comes from accepting mystery. This is perhaps the hardest shift to make. The shift from needing to know to being okay not knowing, from demanding understanding to accepting mystery, from requiring explanation to allowing some things to remain unexplained. This goes against everything in their psychology, everything they learned, everything that kept them safe, but it is necessary, because life is full of mysteries, things that cannot be explained, things that do not make sense, things that remain unclear no matter how much you analyze. And if you cannot tolerate mystery, if you cannot accept that some things will never be understood, you will spend your entire life in frustration, in disappointment, in waiting. And life is too short for that, too precious for that, too important for that. And so you must learn, slowly, gently, painfully, to accept mystery, to allow unanswered questions to exist, to tolerate the discomfort of not knowing, not happily, not easily, but acceptingly, recognizingly, peacefully, eventually. Not everything has an explanation. Not everything happens for a reason. Not everything makes sense. Some things are random. Some things are chaotic. Some things are simply the result of someone else's choices that had nothing to do with you. And seeking deeper meaning where none exists is exhausting, is futile, is a waste of precious energy. And sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is accept that you will never know, that the question will remain unanswered, that the confusion will never fully resolve, that this is simply one of life's mysteries, one of the things that does not make sense, one of the endings that was never explained. And accepting this does not mean you are okay with it, does not mean you think it was right, does not mean you have forgiven the person who left you in confusion. It just means you are no longer letting the confusion control your life. You are no longer waiting for understanding before you move forward. You are accepting the mystery and living anyway. And that acceptance, that choice to live despite not knowing, is healing, is freedom, is life. The peace that comes from accepting mystery is different from the peace that would have come from getting answers. It is quieter, less dramatic, less complete, but it is peace nonetheless. It is the peace of no longer fighting, no longer pursuing, no longer waiting. It is the peace of acceptance, of letting go, of moving forward. And this peace is available right now, without their participation, without their explanation, without their presence. You can have peace, you can have release, you can have forward movement without them, without their answers, without the closure they refuse to give. And choosing this peace, choosing this acceptance, choosing to embrace mystery rather than endlessly seek explanation, is choosing yourself, is choosing your life, is choosing healing on your terms. And that is powerful, that is transformative, that is everything. Accepting mystery doesn't mean you've stopped caring about truth. It means you've recognized that some truths are not yours to know, that some questions will never be answered, that some stories will remain incomplete, and that life somehow continues anyway. Not perfectly, not without grief, not without occasional wondering. But it continues. It moves forward. It exists independent of the answers you never received. And that existence, that forward movement, that life you build without understanding, is valid, is meaningful, is enough. And accepting this, truly accepting this, frees you from the waiting, frees you from the pursuit, frees you from the need for external validation of your experience. You are free to live, to heal, to move forward without them, without their answers, without their participation in your healing. And that freedom, while not what you wanted, while not what you deserved, is still freedom. And it is available, and it is yours to claim whenever you are ready. Healing also requires releasing the fantasy of eventual understanding, the fantasy that one day they will reach out, one day they will explain, one day everything will make sense. This fantasy is comforting. It keeps hope alive. It gives you something to look forward to. But it also keeps you waiting, keeps you holding space for something that will likely never come, keeps you oriented toward the past rather than the present, keeps your life on hold until a future that may never arrive. And holding on to this fantasy, while it feels like hope, is actually preventing healing. Because healing requires accepting current reality. And current reality is that they have not explained. They have not reached out. They have not provided closure. And they likely never will. And holding space for the possibility that they might, while understandable, while natural, is keeping you stuck in fantasy rather than engaged with reality. And reality is where healing happens. Fantasy is where waiting happens, and you have waited long enough. Releasing the fantasy is grief. It is grieving the closure you will never receive, grieving the explanation you will never hear, grieving the understanding you will never have. It is accepting that the ending, as inadequate as it was, is the only ending you will get. That the silence, as painful as it is the only answer you will receive. That the confusion, as unbearable as it feels, is what you must live with. And accepting this is hard, is painful, is one of the most difficult things you will ever do. Because the fantasy protected you, gave you hope, gave you something to look forward to. And releasing it feels like releasing the last possibility of resolution, the last chance of understanding, the last hope of closure. But holding on to it is holding on to illusion. And illusion, while comforting, is not truth. And healing requires truth, requires accepting what is, not what might be, not what should have been, but what is. And what is that they will not explain. They will not reach out. They will not provide the closure you deserve. And you must heal anyway. Without it. Without them. Without the fantasy. And healing without fantasy is harder. But it is also more real, more lasting, more true. And truth, however painful, is the foundation on which healing is built. The grief of releasing the fantasy is real. It is saying goodbye not just to the person, but to the possibility of resolution. Saying goodbye to the hope that one day it would all make sense. Saying goodbye to the belief that eventually you would understand. And this goodbye is final in a way the original ending was not. Because the original ending left room for possibility. Room for maybe, room for someday. But releasing the fantasy closes that room, says there is no maybe, there is no someday, there is only what is, and what is silence. And accepting that silence as the final answer is grief, is loss, is the death of hope, and it must be grieved, must be mourned, must be honoured, not rushed through, not bypassed, but felt fully, cried through, released slowly, and only after this grief is processed can the space it occupied be freed. Can the energy it consumed be reclaimed? Can the future it held hostage be entered? And entering that future requires letting go of the past, letting go of the fantasy, letting go of the maybe, and choosing what is, choosing now, choosing reality, however painful, however incomplete, however unsatisfying, choosing it and building from it and moving forward from it without looking back, without waiting, without hoping for something that will not come. Releasing the fantasy is not cynicism, it is acceptance. And acceptance doesn't mean you're okay with what happened. It means you're no longer waiting for it to change. You're no longer holding space for an explanation that isn't coming. You're making space for what is, right now, without them. And that space, that presence, that nowness is where life exists. Not in the past, not in the future fantasy, but in the present reality. And the present reality is that you are here, you are alive, you are healing, without their explanation, without their participation, without their presence. And you are doing it. You are moving forward. You are building a life that exists independent of their answers, and that life is real, is valid, is meaningful, and it is yours, and it does not require their validation, does not require their explanation, does not require their participation. It just requires you choosing yourself, choosing presence, choosing reality, and living, finally, fully, without them. Another crucial element of healing is learning to trust yourself without external validation. Throughout this entire pattern, the underlying issue has been that your reality required external confirmation. You needed them to validate that what happened was real, to confirm that your perception was accurate, to acknowledge that the ending occurred, that the harm was done, that your confusion was legitimate. And without this external validation, your experience felt uncertain, questionable. Like maybe you imagined it, maybe you overreacted, maybe it was not as significant as you thought, and so you sought validation, sought acknowledgement, sought their confirmation that yes, this happened, yes, it hurt, yes, you deserve explanation. But that validation never came, and so you were left doubting yourself, doubting your experience, doubting your perception. And this self-doubt kept you stuck, kept you seeking, kept you waiting for external confirmation before you could trust your own experience. Healing requires learning that your experience is real without their confirmation, that what happened to you is valid without their acknowledgement, that your pain matters without their apology, that your perception is trustworthy without their agreement. And this is hard, because you have learned to doubt yourself, learned to second-guess your experience, learned that your reality is questionable without external validation. But your reality is not questionable, it is real, it happened, you were there, you experienced it, you felt it, and no one else's denial or silence or refusal to acknowledge changes that. What you experienced is true, what you felt is valid, what you perceived is accurate, and you do not need their agreement to know this. You do not need their confirmation to trust yourself. You do not need their validation to honor your experience. You know what happened, and that is enough. That is all you need, your own knowing, your own truth, your own experience. And trusting that, without external confirmation, is healing, is empowering, is taking your power back from someone who tried to make you doubt your reality by refusing to acknowledge it. Am I being too sensitive? Am I overthinking? Am I imagining things? These questions are not innocent. They are the internalized voice of every person who invalidated your experience. every person who dismissed your pain, every person who refused to acknowledge harm. These questions keep you doubting, keep you seeking external validation, keep you unable to trust your own perception. But these questions are not yours. They were given to you by people who did not want to be accountable, by people who found it easier to make you doubt yourself than to acknowledge what they did. And holding on to these questions, holding on to the need for external validation before you can trust yourself, is giving them power they do not deserve, is allowing their silence to continue invalidating your experience, is letting their refusal to acknowledge harm prevent you from honoring it yourself. And you must stop this, must reclaim your own knowing, must trust yourself even when no one else validates you. Because your experience is real, your pain is valid, your perception is accurate, and you were there. You know what happened, and that is enough. Your perception of what happened doesn't require their agreement to be true. Your pain doesn't need their acknowledgement to matter. Your reality doesn't need their validation to exist. You were there. You know. And that is enough. It has always been enough. You just needed permission to believe yourself. And I am giving you that permission now. Believe yourself. Trust your perception. Honor your experience without waiting for them to confirm it, without needing them to validate it, without requiring them to acknowledge it. What you know is true. What you felt is real. What you experienced matters. And their silence does not change any of that. It just reveals their character, their priorities, their lack of care. But it does not change your truth. And your truth is valuable, is important, is worth honoring, even if no one else does. Especially if no one else does. Honor it yourself, trust it yourself, believe it yourself. And that self-belief, that self-trust, that self-validation is healing, is empowerment, is freedom from the need for external confirmation. And that freedom is yours, right now, without them, without their answers, without their participation. It has always been yours. You just needed to claim it. From a psychological standpoint, healing is not about getting answers. It is about finding peace without them. It is about learning that your life can continue, can thrive, can be meaningful, even when the past remains unclear. It is about integration, about taking what happened, unanswered as it is, and finding a way to live with it that does not destroy you. It is about carrying the experience without letting the experience control you. It is about remembering the confusion without being consumed by it. It is about acknowledging the wound without living from the wound. And this integration does not require explanation, does not require understanding, does not require answers. It requires something else. It requires self-compassion, self-trust, self-validation. It requires choosing yourself over the closure they refuse to give. It requires building a life that exists independent of their answers. And this is possible. This is achievable. This is happening right now. In every moment you choose forward over waiting. In every moment you choose present over past. In every moment you choose yourself over their explanation. You are healing, not completely, not perfectly, but genuinely. And that healing is real, is valid, is meaningful, and it is yours. The goal is not to get the answers you were denied. The goal is to build peace that exists without them. The goal is to create closure that does not depend on them. The goal is to move forward in a life that is no longer held hostage by their silence. And this goal is achievable, not through getting them to explain, but through explaining to yourself that their explanation is no longer necessary, not because you do not deserve it, you do, but because waiting for it is costing you more than receiving it would give you. Because the years you spend waiting are years you do not get back. Because your life is happening now, not in some future when they finally reach out, but now. And every moment you spend waiting is a moment you are not living, and you deserve to live. You deserve to heal. You deserve to move forward. Without them, without their answers, without their closure, you deserve your life back, and taking it back is your responsibility, your choice, your power, and that power is available right now, today, this moment. You can choose to stop waiting, to stop seeking, to stop holding space for something that will not come, and you can choose to live, to heal, to build without them. And that choice, that decision, that claiming of your life is healing, is everything, is what you've been waiting for, not their explanation, but your own permission to move forward without it. And I am giving you that permission now. You are allowed to stop waiting. You are allowed to move forward. You are allowed to heal without their answers, without their presence, without their participation. You are allowed, and you can, and you will. The person who waited for answers doesn't disappear when healing happens. They just stop letting unanswered questions control their life. They hold the questions without being held by them, and that shift is everything. It is the shift from being controlled by the past to being informed by it, from being defined by what happened to being shaped by it but not limited by it, from surviving confusion to building a life that exists despite it. And this shift is gradual, is imperfect, is ongoing. Some days they manage it well. Some days they fall back into old patterns. Some days they wake up still thinking about the unanswered questions. Some days they do not think about them at all. And all of this is normal. All of this is healing, not linear healing, not perfect healing, but real healing, genuine progress, actual forward movement. And that is enough. That is everything. That is what matters. Healing looks different for everyone, but there are common elements. You think about the unanswered questions less often. When you do think about them, the thoughts do not spiral. You can talk about what happened without becoming consumed by confusion. You do not check their social media to look for clues. You do not create elaborate theories about what they might be thinking. You are present in current relationships without constantly comparing them to past unanswered ones. You can tolerate ambiguity in new situations without panicking. You have created your own narrative about what happened, and while it may not be certain, it is enough. You have moved forward in your life in ways that are no longer defined by the confusion. You have built new relationships, new experiences, new meaning that exists independent of understanding the past. And when someone mentions the unanswered questions, when you are reminded of the confusion, you feel something. But what you feel is different now. Less consuming, less urgent, less controlling. You feel it, and then you let it go. You acknowledge it, and then you move forward. You remember it, and then you return to your present. And this ability to touch the pain without being controlled by it is healing, is the marker of integration, is the sign that while the questions remain unanswered, you have found peace anyway. Healing doesn't mean you never wonder. It means the wondering doesn't consume you. It means you can hold the question without being held hostage by it. It means you've built a life that exists independent of their answer, and that life is rich, is meaningful, is full, not in spite of the unanswered questions, but alongside them. The questions exist, the confusion remains, the mystery persists, but your life persists too, and your life is stronger, is louder, is more present. And so the questions fade to background, still there, but no longer dominant, still present, but no longer controlling, still unanswered, but no longer preventing. And this is healing. Not the healing you wanted, not the healing you expected, but healing nonetheless, real, valid, sufficient, and it is yours, and it is enough. Protection in adulthood looks different than what was missing in childhood. In childhood, protection would have meant receiving answers, having endings explained, getting clarity when confusion arose, being given the information needed to make sense of experience. But that did not happen, and you cannot go back and change it. So protection now means something else. It means choosing people who communicate clearly. It means walking away from people who go silent without explanation. It means requiring that endings be discussed, not just enacted. It means not accepting relationships where ambiguity is the norm. It means surrounding yourself with people who value clarity as much as you do. It means building an environment where unanswered questions are the exception, not the rule. And this is possible. This is within your control. You cannot make people from your past explain themselves, but you can choose people in your future who explain themselves naturally, who communicate, who finish conversations, who provide closure. And choosing these people is protecting yourself, is honoring what you learned, is using the pain of the past to inform the choices of the future. And that is wisdom. That is growth. That is healing in action. Protection now means walking away from people who refuse to communicate. It means not staying in relationships where silence is used as punishment. It means not accepting friendships where ghosting is normal. It means not tolerating romantic partners who disappear without explanation. It means setting a standard that says, I deserve clarity, I deserve communication, I deserve to have endings explained. And if you cannot provide that, then this relationship cannot continue. And this standard is not harsh. It is not demanding. It is basic respect. And people who care about you will meet it, will communicate with you, will explain themselves when things change, will not leave you in confusion. And people who cannot meet this standard are people who do not respect you enough to be in your life. And walking away from them is not loss. It is protection, is self-respect, is honoring what you need and refusing to settle for less. And that refusal is powerful, is transformative, is healing. Protection is no longer about forcing others to give you answers. It is about not staying with people who refuse to. It is about honoring your need for clarity by choosing relationships where clarity is given, where communication is valued, where endings are explained. And these relationships exist. These people exist. People who communicate clearly, who do not go silent without reason, who explain themselves when things change, who provide closure naturally, who respect your need to understand. And finding these people requires boundaries, requires standards, requires walking away from people who do not meet those standards, requires choosing differently, requires believing that you deserve better. And you do. You deserve people who communicate, who explain, who finish conversations, who do not leave you guessing, who respect your need for clarity. And those people are out there, and they are worth waiting for, worth choosing, worth keeping. And building a life surrounded by these people is protection, is creating the environment you needed as a child but can create for yourself as an adult. And that creation is healing, is empowerment, is life-changing. The person who waits for answers that never arrive learned something most people never do. They learned the pain of living in limbo. They learned what it means to have questions that cannot be answered. They learned the exhaustion of rumination. They learned the grief of ambiguous loss. They learned the frustration of needing closure that will not come. And through all of this learning, they developed something. They developed appreciation for clarity, for people who explain themselves, for relationships that make sense. They developed a deep understanding of how painful confusion is, of how necessary communication is, of how valuable it is when people finish conversations. And this understanding makes them different, makes them more conscientious communicators, makes them people who do not leave others in confusion, who explain themselves, who finish conversations, who provide closure, because they know what it is like not to receive these things, and they do not want anyone else to experience that pain, and so they become the communicators they needed, the explainers they wished for, the people who provide closure because they understand how necessary it is. They also learned persistence in seeking truth. They learned not to accept easy answers. They learned to ask questions, to seek clarity, to pursue understanding. And while this pattern can become problematic, when taken too far, when balanced, it is a strength. It makes them thorough, makes them thoughtful, makes them people who do not settle for surface explanations, who dig deeper, who want to truly understand. And this depth is valuable, is meaningful, is a capacity many people lack. And while it came from pain, while it was born from the frustration of not receiving answers, it is still real, still useful, still a strength. And acknowledging this does not mean the pain was worth it, does not mean the confusion was good, but it means something came from it, something valuable, something that makes them who they are, and that something can be honoured while also honouring the cost. Both can be true. The strength is real, and the pain is real, and holding both is what integration means. But what they develop through waiting should not be confused with waiting itself being valuable. The pain of living without answers was not valuable. The years spent in confusion were not productive. The grief of ambiguous loss was not good. These things caused harm, created wounds, built patterns that brought suffering. And acknowledging the capacities that developed does not mean the suffering should have happened. It does not mean everything happens for a reason. It does not mean the pain was necessary. It means that human beings are resilient, that they find ways to survive, that they develop capacities in response to hardship, and those capacities are real, but so is the cost. And healing means honouring both, the strength that came from pain, and the pain that should not have been necessary. Both matter, both are true, and holding both without having to choose which is more important is what allows complete healing, what allows moving forward, what allows building a future that honours what was while creating what can be. What they developed is real. What they lost is also real. And healing means honouring both without having to choose which matters more. The strength that came from waiting, and the years that were lost to waiting, the capacity that was built from confusion. and the confusion that should never have been imposed, the growth that came from pain, and the pain that should never have been inflicted. All of it is real, all of it matters, and all of it can be held, can be honoured, can be integrated, without one negating the other, without one being more important than the other. Both exist, both shaped who they became, and both deserve acknowledgement, deserve recognition, deserve to be carried forward as part of the complete story. Not just the pain, not just the strength, but both, together, fully, honestly. The person who waited for answers grew into an adult who knows how to survive uncertainty. They mastered survival of ambiguity. They learned how to exist in confusion. They learned how to live without closure. They learned how to function despite not understanding. And these are real skills, valuable skills, skills that served them in a world that is often unclear, often ambiguous, often confusing. But survival was never supposed to be the goal. Survival is what you do when you have no other choice, when the alternative is worse, when you are just trying to make it through. But there is supposed to be more than survival. There is supposed to be living. And living is different. Living means relationships where confusion is addressed, not ignored. It means endings that are explained, not just enacted. It means questions that are answered, not left hanging. It means closure that is mutual, not imposed. It means communication that is clear, not ambiguous. It means trust that is earned, not assumed. It means presence that is consistent, not intermittent. It means care that is reliable, not conditional. Living means you do not have to spend all your energy surviving confusion, managing ambiguity, tolerating uncertainty, creating your own closure. You can actually be present, actually engage, actually connect, because the environment allows it, because the people allow it, because clarity is the norm, not the exception. And this is what you deserve. This is what you have always deserved. And this is what healing makes possible. The next chapter is about learning what living looks like, learning to experience relationships without constantly demanding answers, learning to trust without needing constant clarification, learning to tolerate reasonable ambiguity without panicking, learning to allow some questions to remain unanswered without spiraling, learning to be present in your life as it is, not as you wish it were explained, learning to move forward without understanding everything, learning to find peace without all the answers, learning to choose yourself when others refuse to choose clarity, learning to honour your need for communication while also developing tolerance for normal uncertainty, learning to distinguish between dangerous ambiguity and normal ambiguity, learning to set boundaries around pursuing answers while also knowing when to stop, learning to grieve without closure, learning to trust yourself without external validation, learning to build a life that is meaningful despite unanswered questions, learning to create your own sense of completion, learning to close loops internally when external closure will not come. This is not forgetting what happened. It is not erasing the confusion. It is not pretending the pain did not exist. It is not saying the unanswered questions do not matter. It is building something new alongside the old. It is taking the awareness that came from living without answers and using it without being imprisoned by it. It is allowing the past to inform you without controlling you. It is holding the history without being defined by it. It is carrying the questions without being consumed by them. It is integrating what was while creating what could be. It is acknowledging that some things will never be understood while still moving forward. It is accepting that closure is not always external while creating internal completion. It is recognizing that healing does not require their answers while still honoring that you deserved them. It is honoring your experience while releasing the need for their validation. It is trusting yourself while letting go of their explanation. It is choosing peace over certainty. It is choosing presence over understanding. It is choosing yourself over their silence. This means that questions can exist without controlling you. That confusion can remain without consuming you. That ambiguity can be present without threatening you. That unanswered can simply mean unanswered, not dangerous. That some things will remain mysteries and that is not catastrophe. That life can be lived fully even when not everything is understood fully. That meaning can be created even when explanation was not provided. That relationships can be built even when past relationships ended without closure. That forward movement is possible even when backward understanding is impossible. That you can be okay even when they never explain. That you can heal even when they never apologize. That you can live even when they never provide answers. That your life does not require their participation. That your healing does not need their permission. That your peace does not depend on their explanation. And claiming this independence, this autonomy, this self-sufficiency and healing is power, is freedom, is everything. And slowly over time, the nervous system learns something it never did before. That not knowing doesn't equal danger. That questions can remain unanswered without destroying you. That life can move forward even when the past remains unclear. That closure is not always external. Sometimes it is simply the decision to stop waiting. And that shift, when it finally lands, changes everything. It doesn't give you the answers you sought, but it gives you something more important, your life back. No longer held hostage by questions that will never be answered. No longer frozen by confusion that will never resolve. No longer waiting for permission to move forward from someone who will never give it. This is not giving up on truth. This is choosing peace over certainty, choosing presence over answers, choosing your future over their silence. This is recognizing that you have spent enough years waiting, that you have given enough energy to unanswered questions, that you have held space long enough for closure that will not come, and that your life, your healing, your future matter more than understanding your past, that moving forward matters more than looking backward, that living matters more than understanding, and choosing to live, choosing to heal, choosing to move forward without their answers is not weakness. It is strength. It is courage. It is the most powerful thing you can do. This is not defeat. This is reclaiming what was taken from you, not the answers. You cannot reclaim those because they were never given. But your life, your time, your energy, your future, your peace, these were held hostage by unanswered questions, and you are taking them back. You are saying, I have waited long enough. I have sought long enough. I have suffered long enough, and I am choosing to stop. Not because I got what I needed, but because I am more important than what I did not receive. Because my life is more valuable than their explanation. Because my healing is more significant than their closure. Because I matter, and my life matters, and I am no longer giving my life to questions that will never be answered. I am taking my life back, and I am living it without them, without their answers, without their participation. And that is not giving up, that is healing.